In this lesson, we will learn about prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. The essential questions for this lesson are what are the basic characteristics of prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, and how are these cells classified into currently recognized kingdoms? If you can remember from our last unit, we defined a cell as the basic unit of life for all living things. So when we talk about cells, we can break them down into two basic types. The first, prokaryotic, would be classifying bacteria and archaeobacteria. The second, eukaryotic, would classify kingdoms such as your protists, your fungi, your plants, and your animals. So you being an animal, your cells would be classified as eukaryotic cells. To better understand the main difference between these two cells, which has a lot to do with the nucleus, we can look at the prefix and the suffix of each word. The prefix pro means before, and the suffix kary in Greek means nucleus. So if you put that together, prokaryotic, it would mean before nucleus or no nucleus. Eukaryotic, the prefix eu means true. Again, the suffix kary means nucleus, so putting the two together, we get true nucleus or with nucleus. So just by looking at those Greek root words, we can already identify the main difference between the two types of cells. The prokaryotic cell came before a nucleus, otherwise it does not have a nucleus, while the eukaryotic cell does have a nucleus. So let's start with just some of the main similarities between these two types of cells, because they are both cells, so they do have some things in common. The first of those would be they both contain DNA, or genetic material. The second is they both have a plasma cell membrane which protects the cell and will be located around the outside of the cell. The third thing they have in common is cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is that jelly-like material that houses the organelles, and that's where chemical reactions will take place. And the fourth thing that they have in common are ribosomes. Ribosomes are organelles or cell structures that make proteins. Now, what are their main differences? Quite a few. To start, as we mentioned with the root words, prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus, while eukaryotic cells do. Prokaryotic cells lack organelles, which are the structures that make up a cell, while eukaryotic cells have several organelles. Prokaryotic cells are only going to be found in simple organisms that are unicellular. Uni means one, so we're talking about those single-celled organisms. Eukaryotic cells can exist in unicellular organisms, but also exist in multicellular organisms or more complex organisms. The prokaryotic cell came before the nucleus, so it is the oldest cell type, while the eukaryotic cell does contain a nucleus, which leads scientists to believe that it evolved from prokaryotic cells. Since prokaryotic cells are only unicellular, they're going to be much smaller than eukaryotic cells. In a prokaryotic cell, they do not have a nucleus, so the DNA is not found in the nucleus, it is just found within the cell, while in the eukaryotic cell, the DNA is located inside the nucleus. And finally, in terms of reproduction, since prokaryotic cells are always going to be found in simple unicellular organisms, they reproduce asexually, while eukaryotic cell and multicellular organisms would need to reproduce sexually. So let's look a little bit more at the nucleus, that main distinct difference between the two cells. As we mentioned, prokaryotic cells came before the nucleus, so their cells do not have a membrane-bound nucleus. The eukaryotic cell came after or evolved from the prokaryotic cell, so it does have a true nucleus. If you look at these diagrams, you'll be able to see the distinct difference. The nucleus is that large dark circle, typically kind of found in the center of the cell. And if you compare that to the prokaryotic image, you don't see that same thing. The next distinct difference were the organelles. So again, on the left we have a prokaryotic cell, and on the right we have a type of eukaryotic cell, in this case an animal cell. And you can see already the eukaryotic cell is much more complex. Prokaryotic cells lack organelles. Eukaryotic cells have multiple organelles with many different functions. Another main difference was the types of organisms that are made up of these cells and the size. So we said prokaryotic cells are going to be found in unicellular organisms that are made of only one cell. Because they're only one cell, all life activities have to be carried out by that cell by itself with its internal structures, whereas a eukaryotic cell is going to be typically found in a multicellular organism, such as these elephants that you see. They're made up of more than one cell, so one cell doesn't have to do every life activity. Different cells are specialized and have their own specific function to carry out. The next main difference is the size of the cells. This picture on the left, you can kind of see a graphic visual to compare the size so you really understand how much smaller the prokaryotic cell is from the animal cell. Typically, a prokaryotic cell is going to be 10 times smaller than a eukaryotic cell. And then we're going to also compare the DNA. As we said, both cells do have DNA. They have that genetic material that determines what type of cell it is, what type of organism it is, and helps it carry out its different life functions. But the main difference is in a prokaryotic cell, the DNA is just one single chromosome attached to the cell membrane, whereas in a eukaryotic cell, there's linear chromosomes, so multiple chromosomes that are found within the nucleus. If we're looking at a human being cell, you would find 23 pairs of chromosomes or 46 chromosomes, but that will differ based on the organism. Reproduction was also one of the major differences. Prokaryotic cells reproduce asexually, which means two genetically identical cells are produced from one original cell. It does not need a mate. Whereas in eukaryotic cells, they reproduce sexually, so there needs to be more than one cell. New cells' genetic material is 50% from one parent and 50% from the other parent. So if you look at different organisms made up of eukaryotic cells, again referring to ourselves, human beings, we are not 100% identical to either parent because we were reproduced through sexual reproduction. We get 50% of our DNA from mom, 50% from dad, so we're a genetic combination or genetically varied. In the case of asexual reproduction, it would almost be similar to like cloning. They're 100% identical in their DNA. Now, looking at some different types of organisms that would be classified under these two types of cells, as we mentioned earlier, prokaryotes are going to be your bacteria, typically. So here are just three examples of bacteria. E. coli, one that's very familiar to many of us. It is the type of bacteria that gives us intestinal diseases. And then we have Streptococcus bacterium, otherwise known as strep throat. That's what gives us strep throat. And then there's also Streptomyces bacterium, which gives us the antibiotic streptomycin. Eukaryote organisms are much more familiar to us since it comprises the four kingdoms that we're more familiar with, or even more so just the plant and animal kingdom that we just grew up learning about. So these are just a couple of examples of organisms with eukaryotic cells. Yeast, which would be a type of fungus. Paramecia, which would be a type of protist. Mushrooms, again, the fungus. Grass, potatoes, trees. Algae would be plant. Frogs and humans would be classified as animals. Obviously, there's many, many more that we could list, but since we're more familiar with those, you could probably think of those on your own. So to make sure that you understand this lesson, make sure that you can differentiate between the characteristics of prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, and also make sure you can diagram how these cells fit into currently recognized kingdoms. Remember, the kingdoms that we're talking about would be protist, fungi, bacteria, plant, and animal.